In the name of God, hello everybody. This is session 2 of your discourse analysis lesson. As you know, in the previous session, I talked about the differences between linguistic forms and functions. Then I talk about the differences between written language and a spoken language, and about the text, written text and spoken text. Okay, in this session, I want to talk about the relationship between, again, speech and writing. The view that written language and spoken language serve in general quite different functions in society has been forcefully propounded, hardly surprisingly, by scholars whose main interest lies in anthropology and sociology. For example, someone like Goody, Watts, and Goody suggests that analytic thinking followed the acquisition of written language, since it was the setting down of a speech that enabled man clearly to separate words, to manipulate their order, and to develop syllogistic forms of reasoning. So this is, the idea about the written language. So they think that some persons think that the analytic thinking followed the acquisition of written language. So Goody suggests that written language has two main functions. The first is the storage function, which permits communication over time and space. Okay, so according to Goody's opinion, the written language has two main functions. The first function is the storage function. Okay, with written language we can store the communication over time and space. And the second function is that which shift language from the oral to the visual domain, okay, and permits words and sentences to be examined out of their original context, where they appear in a very different and highly abstract context. So the second function of written language, according to Goody's opinion, is that the written language shifts language from the oral to the visual domain. These are two functions of the written language. So it seems reasonable to suggest that whereas in daily life, in a literature culture, we use speech largely for the establishment and maintenance of human relationships, we use written language largely for working off and transference of information. So it appears that we use speech language for just maintenance of human relationship, and we use a written language for transference of information. This is the functions of two kinds of form of language: written language and spoken language. In this part, I want to talk about the differences between written and spoken language again. The major differences between speech and written derive from the fact that one is essentially transitory, the speech, and the other is designed to be permanent, written language. So it seems that there are a main difference between speech and writing. Speech is a kind of transitory language, but the written language is a kind of permanent language. So in this part, I want to talk about the differences between written and spoken language. The first difference between written language and a spoken language is that the syntax of a spoken language is typically much less structured than that of written language. So it seems that the spoken language syntax is more simpler, okay, than written language. This is the first difference. It means that, for example, spoken language contains many incomplete sentences, often simply sequences of phrases in a spoken language. Spoken language again typically contain rather little subordination. Okay, in a spoken language, it seems that we can see, little kind of subordination language. And three, in conversational speech, where sentential syntax can be observed, active declarative forms are normally found. It means that we cannot, we can't find passive sentences, just we can see active sentences. This is okay. This is the sub parts of the first difference. The second difference between spoken language and written language is that in written language an extensive set of metalingual markers exist to mark relationship between clauses. For example, like complementizer, we use many complementizers in written language, like when, while, you see here, or connectors like beside, moreover, however, in spite of. You see these kind of words in written language, not spoken language. It doesn't mean that we don't use any of these connector in our speech, but they are rare. Okay, in a spoken language, they largely practically organized chunks are related by just and, but, then, more. So in spoken language we use this kind of connector, just and, but, or then. We don't use many of these connectors, complementizer, like when, while. Okay, this is kind of connector which we use in written language more than spoken language. So this is another difference between written language and a spoken language. So for example, the speaker is typically less explicit than the writer. For example, I am so tired, I had to walk all the way home. The speaker, the speaker says this kind of sentence. Okay, he or she, doesn't say because. Just he says, for example, I am so tired, I had to walk all the time home. This kind of connector, like because, it belongs to written language, not to spoken language. So in written language, rhetorical organizers of larger stretches of discourse appears, like for example in written language again we use firstly, more important than, in conclusion. These are rare in a spoken language. Okay, you see here, these are rare in a spoken language. This is the second difference, the main difference between a written language and a spoken language. The third difference between written language and a spoken language is that in written language, rather heavily pre-modified noun phrases like that one are quite common. Okay, it is rare in a spoken language to find more than two pre-modifying adjectives. Just we use one, for example, adjective as a modifier of the noun, and there is a strong tendency to structure the short chunks of a speech so that only one predicate is attached to a given referent at a time. Okay, so just we use one predicate. So we can conclude that our sentences in a spoken language are more simpler than written language. Okay, so for example, it is a biggish cat, for example, with torn ears. Or old man MacArthur, for example, he was a wee chap, very small, or for example a bird, and he was pretty stupid. You see here, we use simpler sentences than written language. The fourth difference between written language and a spoken language is that whereas written language sentences are generally structured in subject, predicate form. In a spoken language, it is quite common to find what given called topic comment. So, in written language, the form of sentences are consist of two parts: subject, predicate. But in a spoken language, we use a kind of topic, then talks about that topic. For example, we say, the cats, did you let them out? So you see here, we introduce a kind of topic and then an explanation of that, about that topic. So this is another difference between written language and a spoken language. And I think the difference number 5, in formal speech, the occurrences of passive construction is relatively infrequent. As I told you, in speech, in spoken language, we use just active sentences, not passive sentences. Okay, the use of the passive in written language, which allow non-attribution of agency, is typically absent from conversational speech. So just we use passive sentences in written language, and it's rare in spoken language. So instead, active construction with indeterminate group agents are noticeable. For example, in this example, everything they do in Edinburgh, they do it far too slowly. This is a kind of sentence which we use in a spoken language. The other difference between written language and a spoken language is that the speaker may replace or refine expressions as he goes along. Okay, in the spoken language, okay, the speaker may replace the expressions. For example, he or she says, this man, again, this chap, she was. You see here, replace the words instead of each other. This man, this chap, she, you see. Okay, you see here, this man, this chap. Okay, we use a kind of different words instead of each other in the spoken language, and the speaker use this kind of strategy. Okay, the other difference, the speaker typically uses a good deal of rather generalized vocabulary. Okay, like a lot of do, thing, stuff, you see, things like that. This is a kind of generalized vocabulary, and the speaker uses them, not in written form. Just in the spoken language, we use more generalized vocabulary, like a lot of, things like that. You see here, the other difference again between written language and spoken language is that the speaker frequently repeats the same syntactic form several times over. Okay, so the speaker uses or repeats the same syntactic form. For example, I look at fire extinguisher, I look at fire exist, I look at what gangways are available, I look at electric cables, I look at. You see here, the speaker so repeats the same syntactic form, but we don't use this kind of repetition in our written language. So this is another difference between written language and a spoken language. The other difference between written language and a spoken language is that the speaker may produce a large number of prefabricated feelers. So the speaker uses more feelers like well, yes, you know, you see. This is kind of feeler, because by using these words, or we fill our gaps. Okay, you see here, so we call them feelers. The speaker uses a large number of these kind of feelers for filling the gaps in the speaking. So but in written language we don't use feelers. Okay, so these are again, these are the differences between written language and spoken language. If I ask you, okay, in your, for example, final exam about the differences between written language and spoken language, you can talk about the syntax, you can talk about, I mean, the metalingual marker, you can talk about the modifier, and you can talk about the kind of structure in sentences, I mean subject, predicate, and topic, comment. You can talk about the, I mean, passive and active construction, okay, and you can talk about again, excuse me, you can talk about for example, the other difference, which I mean, forgot to talk about it, in chat about the immediate environment, the speaker may rely on gaze direction to, I mean, supply a reference. So we have, in a spoken language, we have a kind of, I mean, extra devices to convey our, I mean, speaking. For example, the gaze direction, or for example, as I told you in the previous session, I mean, body language. We have a kind of body language like gaze direction to convey our, I mean, speaking. This is another difference between a spoken language and written language. Or you can talk about, as I told you, the replacement of the, I mean, expressions in the spoken language. The other difference is about using the generalized vocabulary in a spoken language, not in written language. And the other difference, as I told you about, we can use the same syntactic form in a spoken language, not written language. For example, I look at, I look at, I look at, as I told you. And the last one is the using of the fillers. I mean, the speaker use a large number of fillers for filling the gaps in the conversation, but the speaker, I mean, doesn't use this kind of filler. These are the differences between written language and spoken language. There are kind of, I mean, example we show you. This is a kind of, I think, spoken language, which which, I mean, shows you those differences which I talked about it. For example, you see here, this is, I mean, definition of the, I think, a rainbow. Okay, normally after very heavy rain or something like that, okay, you see here in a spoken language, as I told you, we use incomplete sentences. And you are driving along the road, and far away you see, well, a series, you see, we use a kind of feelers here, okay, as I told you, series of, I mean, stripe formed like a bow, an arc, a very, very far away, you see, we use a kind of repetition, okay, here. And some other, I mean, strategies which we use in a spoken language. So in a spoken language, as I told you, there are some differences, I mean, between spoken language and between written language in many ways, and I told you about them. So in this session, I talk about, again, speech language, and about written language. I talk about the two functions of written language, I mean, for storage of the information and for shifting the language from the oral to the visual domain, as I told you. And at last, I talk about the differences between written and spoken language. And if I ask you about them, you can talk about these, I mean, differences which I explained to you about, I mean, the differences between written language and spoken language. I think that's enough for today. And I will continue, I mean, in the, I mean, next session, I hope. Okay, thank you for your attention, and goodbye, everybody.